So, um, if we jump back to late 1994, there was this American shoe brand, Hush Puppies,
Oh, yeah.
and they were essentially dead.
Completely on life support.
Right. I mean, the company was moving maybe a measly 30,000 pairs a year, tops.
Which is nothing for a national brand.
Exactly. And the shoes themselves were mostly just relegated to, like, backwoods family stores and discount bins.
They were the ultimate Midwestern dad shoe.
The absolute antithesis of cool. I mean, Wolverine, the parent company, they were actively preparing to just euthanize the brand entirely. Just pull the plug.
Because why keep funding a zombie brand?
Right. But then something crazy happens. Within 24 months, you have high-fashion designers wearing them.
It's wild.
And Wolverine goes from selling 30,000 pairs to moving over 1.5 million pairs.
It's 1.5 million. Just an explosive turnaround.
And why? Because a handful of kids in downtown Manhattan just decided they wanted to look ridiculous.
It really is one of the most, absurd, logic-defying turnarounds in corporate history.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, by the way. Today, we are bringing you, yes, you listening right now, a custom-tailored exploration into the hidden architecture of how things catch on.
We're pulling from Malcolm Gladwell's fascinating work, The Tipping Point.
Yes, and our mission today is to decode why the smallest, the most totally insignificant changes often yield these explosive, world-altering results.
It's a huge topic.
It is. But before we get to the heavy societal shifts, we really have to unpack this shoe miracle. Because the mechanics of how this brushed suede shoe resurrected itself, it just completely breaks our standard understanding of cause and effect.
It really does. I mean, if you look at standard marketing theory, you launch a massive campaign, right? You spend millions of dollars on ads.
You hire celebrities.
Exactly. And you hope to, gradually capture market share over time. But Wolverine did none of that.
They did absolutely nothing. Okay, so here's what happens. Two Hush Puppies executives, Ann Baxter and Jeffrey Lewis, they're at a fashion shoot. And they run into this stylist from New York. And this stylist just casually tells them that classic Hush Puppies have suddenly become the ultimate hipster accessory.
In, the clubs and bars of Soho and the East Village.
Yeah. Which, if you're two executives managing a dying, uncool brand, must have sounded completely unhinged.
They were probably like, are you making fun of us?
They were baffled. They're being told there are these resale shops down in the village where kids are actively hunting down dead stock, like old dusty boxes in the back room.
And the key here is that these kids were wearing them ironically.
Yes, precisely because nobody else would. It was a joke to them.
Right. But here's where it accelerates from a weird downtown quirk to a full-on cultural avalanche.
So the executives are told that Isaac Mizrahi is wearing the shoes.
And these guys are like, who is Isaac Mizrahi?
They don't even know who he is. They're totally out of the loop. But by the fall of 1995, the designer John Bartlett calls them up. He wants to use Hush Puppies in his spring collection.
Then Anna Sui wants them for her show.
Right. And out in Los Angeles, there's this designer named Joel Fitzgerald. He literally guts an art gallery next to his Hollywood store, turns it into a Hush Puppies boutique, and puts a 25-foot inflatable basset hound on the roof.
I love that visual so much.
It's amazing. And while he's painting the walls of this pop-up, Pee Wee Herman walks in and buys a couple of pairs.
It's just the perfect storm of unadulterated organic momentum.
By 1996, the president of Wolverine is standing on stage at Lincoln Center. He's shoulder to shoulder with Calvin Klein and Donna Karan.
Which is insane.
Totally insane. And he's accepting the Council of Fashion Designers Award for Best Accessory. For a trend his company literally had nothing to do with creating.
They just rode the wave.
So I have to ask you, how does a dead $30 shoe go from a few East Village kids wearing them as a joke to literally every mall in America?
Well, to understand that, we have to fundamentally change our paradigm. We have to stop thinking of trends as gradual, linear cultural shifts.
Okay, so throw out the old marketing textbook.
Throw it completely out. If we want to understand how a shoe or a behavior or an idea takes over the world, we have to start looking at them as
Epidemics, like a disease.
Exactly like a disease. Ideas, products, messages, and behaviors spread exactly the same way that biological viruses do.
An epidemic of shoes. I mean, it sounds almost funny when you apply it to footwear.
Yeah.
But to really prove that the mechanics of epidemics govern human behavior, I think we have to look at something with much higher stakes.
We definitely do. We need to leave the fashion world and look at actual life and death.
Right. We need to look at New York City in the early 1990s.
Yes, the crime drop.
Let's paint the picture for you, the listener. If you go back to the desperately poor neighborhoods of Brooklyn, places like Brownsville and East New York, in the 1980s and early 90s, the streets were literal ghost towns at dusk.
It was terrifying.
Ordinary working people would not walk on the sidewalks after dark. Children did not ride bikes. Elderly folks didn't sit on their stoops.
The drug trade and the gang warfare were so universally terrifying that people essentially just barricaded themselves indoors at nightfall.
The statistics from that era are staggering. In 1992, there were 2,154 murders in New York City.
Over 2,000. Think about that.
And over 626,000 serious crimes overall. Police officers who served in the Brownsville precinct back then, like Inspector Edward Masadri, they said that the moment the sun went down, their radios just exploded.
Non-stop calls.
He actually said it wasn't uncommon to hear rapid-fire gunshots that sounded like you were in the jungle in Vietnam.
But then, just like the Hush Puppies, something completely inexplicable happened.
It turned on a dime. Within 5 years, murders dropped by 64.3%.
They went from over 2,000 to 770.
Total crimes fell by almost half. The sidewalks filled up again. The kids brought their bikes back out. The gunfire just stopped.
Now, if you ask the conventional experts why this happened, you get a list of very rational macro-level explanations.
Right, the typical academic stuff.
Exactly. The NYPD will tell you, oh, our policing strategies dramatically improved. We implemented CompStat. Criminologists will point out that the crack cocaine epidemic naturally began to recede, and the overall population was aging out of the prime crime-committing demographic.
And the economists chime in too, right?
Right. Economists will argue that the steady improvement in the 1990s economy created jobs for people who might otherwise have turned to crime.
Okay, stop right there, because I don't buy that for a single second.
No.
Not at all. Let's really look at those macro explanations. You're telling me that a gradual, maybe 2 or 3% improvement in the national economy, or a slight demographic shift in the average age of a citizen, results in a vertical 64% plummet in the murder rate of one specific city in a 5-year window.
It doesn't add up.
That math feels completely wrong.
And your skepticism is entirely justified. That is exactly Gladwell's point here. There's a massive puzzling gap between the scale of those supposed causes and the sheer size of the effect.
Right. Crime didn't slowly ebb in New York.
It didn't gently decelerate in proportion to the rising economy. It hit a wall and collapsed.
I always come back to the analogy of boiling water. If you put a pot of water on the stove and turn up the heat, the temperature rises gradually.
Right.
200 degrees, 205, 210, 211.
Yep, getting hotter.
And for all that gradual increase in heat, the physical state of the water does not change. You don't get slightly boiling water at 210 degrees.
It's just hot water.
It sits there looking exactly the same as it did at room temperature, just hotter. But then it hits 212 degrees.
Right.
1 single degree more. And suddenly, instantaneously, everything changes.
The water becomes a gas.
It transforms. It bubbles violently.
That analogy perfectly highlights a fundamental human cognitive bias. Human beings are, by our very nature, gradualists.
We expect things to make sense linearly.
Exactly. We are deeply socialized to expect cause and effect to be strictly proportional.
Right. Like if I want to convince someone I love them, I speak passionately. If I have bad news, I lower my voice. The input is supposed to match the output.
But social problems, trends, and human behaviors, they don't follow proportional rules. They follow the rules of epidemics.
And if we want to understand how the crime rate in New York can collapse, or how a shoe can conquer the globe, we have to understand the 3 specific rules that govern all epidemics.
Contagiousness, little causes having big effects, and sudden change.
Okay, let's pull these apart, starting with rule number 1, contagiousness.
Right.
Now, when I say the word contagious, your mind immediately goes to biology. You think of the flu or the common cold or a terrifying pathogen like Ebola.
We limit contagion to the physical transmission of microbes.
But if crime can be an epidemic and fashion can be an epidemic, then human behavior itself must be contagious.
And it is, in ways that bypass our conscious, rational brain entirely.
Let's prove it to you right now. Think about yawning.
Oh, this is a great example.
Yawning is an incredibly powerful, bizarre act. Just because I am saying the word yawning to you right now, and because I've said the word yawn a few times in the last 30 seconds, a good number of you listening are probably feeling a physical tightness in your jaw.
I'm feeling it right now, honestly.
You're probably going to yawn within the next few minutes. In fact, if you're listening to this on a train or in an office and you just yawned, there's a very high probability that someone who saw you yawn is now yawning too.
Contagiousness is deeply embedded in our neurology. And what's fascinating about the yawn is how multi-layered the contagion is.
It's physically contagious, sure. Like you see it, you do it.
But it's also orally contagious. Researchers have actually played audio tapes of someone yawning to a room full of blind people.
And the blind people yawned.
The blind people yawned. They couldn't see the visual cue, but the sound triggered it. But here is the mechanism that really matters. It's emotionally and psychologically contagious.
Right. If you yawned while listening to me just now, did the thought cross your mind, even for a split second? Am I tired?
You start rationalizing it.
Exactly. Simply by speaking a word into a microphone, I planted a physical feeling of fatigue in your mind. A biological virus can't do that.
You've hijacked their internal state through a social cue. That's the sheer power of behavioral contagion. Which perfectly leads us to the second rule of epidemics: little causes, big effects.
This one directly attacks our bias toward proportionality. Let's do a thought experiment, and I want you, the listener, to really visualize this with me.
Visualize.
Imagine I hand you a very large, incredibly thin piece of paper.
Okay.
I ask you to fold it in half. Then take that folded paper and fold it in half again.
And again.
And again. You do this until you have folded the original piece of paper 50 times.
Which obviously you can't physically do, but mathematically speaking.
Right, mathematically.
Yeah.
How tall is the final stack of paper sitting on the table in front of you?
I mean, most people's intuition fails them completely here. They might guess it's the thickness of a phone book.
Yeah, or if they want to sound bold, they might guess it's as tall as a refrigerator.
But the real answer, the height of a piece of paper folded 50 times, is the distance to the sun.
It's absurd.
And if you fold it one more time, fold number 51, it reaches the sun and comes all the way back to Earth.
It fundamentally breaks the human brain because our brains are wired to think in linear progressions. 1, 2, 3, 4.
But epidemics are geometric progressions. They double. 2, 4, 8, 16.
When a virus spreads, or when a fashion trend spreads, it doubles and doubles again. It goes from a single sheet of paper to the sun in 50 steps. The end result is completely out of proportion to the initial cause.
Which logically demands the third rule. If a tiny cause can geometrically multiply, there must be a specific moment where the math overwhelms the system.
The tipping point.
The third rule is sudden change, the tipping point.
The exact moment of critical mass.
We see this in technology constantly. Look at the Sharp fax machine.
Oh yeah, the 80s.
Sharp introduced the first low-priced fax machine in 1984, and they sold about 80,000 units. Over the next 3 years, sales steadily, gradually ticked up.
Linear progression.
Exactly. But then, in 1987, something shifted. Enough people owned a fax machine that it suddenly made mathematical sense for everyone to get a fax machine.
Because if only one person has a fax machine, it's useless. Who are you going to fax?
Right. The utility of the device tipped. In 1987, they sold 1 million machines. By 1989, 2 million. We saw the exact same trajectory with cell phones in 1998. The technology got a little cheaper, a little smaller, and suddenly, overnight, the entire culture adopted it.
I want to dig into that phrase, though, tipping point, because it didn't actually originate in marketing or tech, did it? It has a much darker sociological origin.
It does. The term first came into popular academic use in the 1970s. It was used to describe the phenomenon of white flight in the older cities of the American Northeast.
Okay, what was the mechanism there?
Sociologists observed that when the number of incoming African Americans in a particular, previously all-white neighborhood reached a certain threshold, usually around 20%, the community would suddenly tip.
The whole neighborhood just flipped.
Yes. Most of the remaining white families would pack up and leave almost immediately. It wasn't a gradual, decade-long demographic transition. It was a sudden, localized evacuation triggered by hitting a very specific mathematical percentage.
20%. And we see that same sudden threshold effect in academic outcomes and poverty, too. The sources highlight this incredible study by Jonathan Crane, a sociologist at the University of Illinois.
That study is fascinating.
He looked at the effect that role models have on teenagers in a community. Specifically, he measured the number of professionals, managers, and teachers people the Census Bureau classifies as high-status workers living in a given neighborhood.
Crane was looking for a linear correlation. He assumed that as the number of professionals decreased, the neighborhood would gradually get worse.
But his findings completely defied gradualism. Crane found that there was virtually no difference in teen pregnancy rates or high school dropout rates in neighborhoods where the high-status population was anywhere between 40% and 5%.
Think about that.
If the number of professionals in your neighborhood dropped from 30% all the way down to 10%, the social problems in the neighborhood didn't really change much.
It stayed stable.
But when the number of high-status workers dropped below 5%, the problems exploded.
The threshold was chillingly precise.
For Black school children in his study, if the percentage of high-status workers in their neighborhood fell just 2.2 percentage points, from 5.6% down to 3.4% dropout rates, didn't just inch up, they more than doubled.
Wow.
Teen childbearing rates, which had barely moved up to that point, suddenly doubled.
We really need to explain the mechanism behind why that happens, because it goes to the heart of the tipping point. Why does 5% matter so much?
What's the trigger?
It's about visible proof of alternative paths. If a teenager sees even a handful of adults in their immediate vicinity waking up, putting on a suit, and going to a stable corporate job, the concept of a professional life remains a tangible reality.
It's like, okay, that's a thing people do.
Right. The neighborhood maintains a baseline of stability, but once you drop below that 5% threshold, the critical mass of positive examples vanishes. The psychological environment fundamentally shifts.
It reminds me of the story Gladwell tells about a puppy seeing snow for the first time.
Oh, I love this analogy.
The puppy steps outside, and it's surrounded by this bizarre, fluffy, freezing white substance.
Oh.
And it's just overwhelmed by the alien landscape. But think about the physics of that moment.
The temperature.
Right. The night before, it was 34 degrees outside, and it was raining. The puppy understands rain. Now it's 31 degrees. The temperature dropped a mere 3 degrees.
Almost nothing.
In the grand scheme of the universe, almost nothing changed in the environment. And yet, everything changed. Rain became something entirely different. A tiny change in input creates a radically different, irreversible reality.
That is the world of the tipping point. It's a place where the unexpected becomes the expected.
So if we know these three rules, contagiousness, little causes having big effects, and sudden change, how do we actually use them?
That's the big question.
Right. To truly see how these rules operate in the real world, we need to dissect an epidemic while it's happening. We need to look at a single crisis from multiple angles.
And to do that, we are going to travel to Baltimore in the mid-1990s.
This is one of the most revealing case studies in the source material because it shows how three different, brilliant experts can look at the exact same data set and see completely different mechanisms at work.
The crisis is this. Between 1995 and 1996, the city of Baltimore experienced a devastating epidemic of syphilis.
We are talking about a 500% increase in the number of babies born with a disease in the space of a single year.
500%.
If you look at the graph of syphilis rates in Baltimore, the line is totally flat for years, and then in 1995, it shoots straight up almost at a right angle. It tipped.
The question is why? What was the little push that sent it over the edge?
Let's look at theory number one. If you ask the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, they point entirely to the environment. Specifically, crack cocaine.
But wait, how does a drug epidemic cause a bacterial epidemic?
Right, they seem disconnected.
The CDC argued that crack fundamentally alters the social geography of a city. Yes, it causes an increase in risky sexual behavior, which accelerates STDs. But more importantly, it brings people from outside the neighborhood into desperately poor areas to buy drugs.
Ah, so it acts as a bridge.
Exactly. Those middle-class or working-class buyers get infected, and then they take the disease back home to their own previously safe neighborhoods. The CDC said crack was the environmental catalyst that broke down the borders between neighborhoods. It turned a localized problem into a raging citywide epidemic.
Okay, so the CDC blames the environment. But then you have theory number two. John Zentelman, a leading expert on STDs at Johns Hopkins University.
Zentelman looks at the exact same data and he says the CDC is wrong.
He says the problem wasn't crack, the problem was bureaucracy.
Which sounds so boring, but it's deadly. Zentelman noted that in 1990 and 1991, Baltimore's public STD clinics were handling about 36,000 patient visits a year.
They were busy.
Very busy. But then the city hit a budget crisis and decided to scale back. They cut the number of clinicians from 17 down to 10. They essentially eliminated the physicians.
Wow.
Patient visits plummeted from 36,000 down to 21,000. Field outreach was slashed. They literally, ran out of antibiotics at one point.
Zentelman's argument is purely mathematical. When the clinics were fully staffed, the disease was kept in equilibrium. A person would get infected, notice the symptoms, go to the clinic, and get treated within a week.
Their infectious window was 7 days.
But when the clinics were gutted and the wait times exploded, a person who would have been cured in a week was now walking around infectious for 2, 3, or 4 weeks.
They had 3 extra weeks to pass it on. The disease tipped because the bureaucracy allowed the infection to linger.
It became stickier in the population. And then we have theory number 3 from John Potterat, a prominent epidemiologist. Potterat argues against both the CDC and Zentelman.
He says the culprit was urban renewal.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive. How does knocking down bad buildings cause a disease to spike?
In the mid-90s, Baltimore decided to demolish these massive, decaying 1960s-style public housing high-rises in East and West Baltimore, places like Lexington Terrace and Lafayette Courts.
These were huge vertical projects, housing hundreds of families.
And yes, they were centers for crime and infectious disease. But when the city dynamited these buildings, they displaced all those people.
Potterat called it a hollowing out, a diaspora.
For years, syphilis had been contained within a very specific, highly concentrated, isolated sociosexual network inside those housing projects. Everyone who had it was sleeping with other people who already lived in that specific building.
But when the city tore the buildings down, the residents were forced to move to other parts of Baltimore.
And they took their behaviors and their infections with them into neighborhoods that had never experienced those problems before. They seeded the rest of the city.
So we have 3 experts. The CDC says it was the drugs changing the environment. Zentelman says it was the budget cuts changing the duration of the disease. Potterat says it was the housing demolition moving the infected people.
Who's actually right?
Yeah, which one is it?
They are all right. And what's truly profound is that none of the changes they point to were massive. Crack had been in Baltimore for years. It just got slightly worse.
The clinics didn't close entirely. They just lost 7 clinicians.
The entire city wasn't destroyed. Just a few housing projects were knocked down.
Little changes, geometric effects.
Exactly. And these 3 theories perfectly map onto the 3 specific ways you can tip any epidemic. An epidemic is a function of 3 variables: the environment it operates in, the infectious agent itself, and the people who carry it.
The context, the stickiness, and the people.
Epidemics tip when there is a change in the context, a change in the stickiness of the agent, or a change in the law of the few.
Okay, let's pull out our magnifying glass and zoom in on these variables, starting with the agent itself, what Gladwell calls the stickiness factor.
This is where we look at how the actual message or the virus itself mutates to become unforgettable, or in a medical sense, permanent.
To really grasp stickiness, we have to look at virology. Viruses mutate constantly. The famous 1918 flu pandemic started in the spring as a relatively tame virus.
People got sick, but they recovered.
But over the summer, the virus underwent a subtle genetic mutation. It didn't change how it spread. It was still airborne. But the agent itself became vastly more deadly.
Over the next 6 months, it killed between 20 and 40 million people worldwide.
The sources provide an even more chilling example of this with HIV. There's a Dutch AIDS researcher named Jaap Goudsmit who tracks the history of a bacterium called Pneumocystis carinii, or PCP.
Now, most of us carry this bacterium in our lungs harmlessly right now. Our immune systems keep it in check.
But if your immune system is wiped out by HIV, PCP flares up and causes an incredibly deadly form of pneumonia. It is essentially the calling card of AIDS.
Goudsmit went back into the medical literature looking for historical outbreaks of PCP to see if he could track the origins of HIV, and he found something horrifying.
Just after World War II, starting in the Baltic port city of Danzig and spreading through Central Europe, there was a massive epidemic of PCP that killed thousands of infants.
He specifically analyzed a coal mining town in the Netherlands called Heerlen. In the 1950s, this town had a training hospital for midwives with a special ward for premature infants known as the Swedish barrack.
Between 1955 and 1958, 81 infants in this single ward came down with PCP. 24 of them died.
Goudsmit hypothesizes that this was an early HIV epidemic. A coal miner from Eastern Europe or Italy likely brought the virus to the town, infected his wife, who then gave birth in the Swedish barrack.
And because the hospital used unsterilized needles for blood transfusions and antibiotics, which was sadly standard practice at the time, the virus spread efficiently from infant to infant.
But here's the detail that stops you in your tracks. Not all the children died. In fact, only a third of them did.
2/3 of those infected infants defeated the virus, purged it from their systems, and lived healthy, normal lives.
Which tells us something monumental. The strain of HIV circulating in the 1950s was fundamentally different from the strain that caused the global crisis in the 1980s.
The 1950s strain was contagious, but it was weak, A premature infant's tiny immune system could fight it off.
But by the 1980s, the virus had mutated. It tipped. Not just because human sexual behaviors changed, but because the virus itself became deadly and permanent.
Once you got it, it stayed. It became sticky.
Now, I know what you're thinking. How does a mutating, deadly virus translate to selling shoes or spreading ideas?
Right, it's a leap.
We have to understand the psychological equivalent of stickiness. In marketing, in podcasting, in leadership, we spend so much time obsessed with reach. We want to know how to make a message contagious, how to get it in front of a million eyeballs.
But contagiousness is useless if the message goes in one ear and out the other.
Exactly. If I tell a million people a boring fact, it doesn't matter that a million people heard it. None of them will remember it tomorrow.
Stickiness means the message creates cognitive friction. It refuses to be processed and discarded. It leaves a permanent mark on the brain.
Let me give you the perfect example of how to manufacture cognitive friction. Let's talk about Winston's cigarettes.
Oh, this is a classic.
In the spring of 1954, Winston rolled out a new filter-tip cigarette with the slogan, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should."
Which, if you know anything about grammar, is deeply incorrect.
It drove English teachers absolutely insane. The correct phrasing should be, "Winston tastes good as a cigarette should."
The use of like as a conjunction was completely ungrammatical, and it created this massive, provocative national controversy. People wrote angry letters to newspapers.
But the marketers at R.J. Reynolds were brilliant. They leaned into the controversy. They turned the grammatical error into a bouncy television jingle and defended it as a fun, colloquial phrasing.
And the result? Winston blew past Parliament, Kent, and L&M. Within a few years, it was the best-selling cigarette in America.
We have to explain why that works. When you hear a perfectly grammatical sentence, your brain processes it smoothly, it glides right through your cognitive filters and disappears.
But when you hear an error, tastes good like a cigarette should, your brain trips over it. It's an anomaly.
It forces the brain to pause, examine the phrase, and essentially solve the puzzle of why it sounds wrong. That tiny moment of cognitive friction is what embeds the slogan into your memory.
The bad grammar was the mutation. It was the viral hook that snagged the brain. To this day, decades later, if you say Winston tastes good, most Americans can finish the sentence.
That is the definition of psychological stickiness.
Stickiness is the hook. But even the stickiest message or the stickiest virus needs the right environment to thrive. And that brings us to the power of context.
This is the radical idea that our behavior, our choices, and our morality are violently dictated by the tiniest details of our immediate situation.
We saw a glimpse of this with Zentelman's syphilis map in Baltimore. Zentelman puts a black star on a map for every syphilis case. In the summer, those stars cluster heavily along the main roads out of East and West Baltimore. The disease is traveling.
But in the winter, the stars literally fade away. It gets cold, people stay inside, they don't go to the bars and street corners where these sexual transactions happen, and the epidemic halts.
The physical weather dictates the disease.
That's a physical, prosaic example of context. But the power of context goes much deeper into human psychology. It suggests that even our deepest moral convictions can be overridden by our environment.
This is where the material gets really dark. Let's talk about Kitty Genovese, 1964. Queens, New York.
Kitty Genovese is chased down the street by an attacker. She is assaulted 3 separate times over the course of half an hour. She is screaming for help.
And during that entire 70-minute ordeal, 38 of her neighbors watched from their apartment windows.
And not a single one of them called the police.
It is one of the most infamous tragedies in American true crime. For decades, the cultural narrative around this was that it was the ultimate proof of urban decay.
Abe Rosenthal, who later became the editor of the New York Times, literally wrote a book saying this was about big city apathy.
He argued that to survive in a chaotic city of millions, people have to build a psychological shell, a conditioned reflex of indifference to their neighbors' suffering. New York made people cold, callous, and dehumanized. That was the story we all accepted.
It's a compelling narrative because it confirms our biases about cities. But psychological research paints a very different and much more unsettling picture.
2 psychologists from New York, Biblitain and John Darley, decided to test this theory of apathy. They didn't believe that 38 people were just inherently evil.
They set up a series of experiments to study what they called the bystander problem. They wanted to know what environmental context actually dictates whether someone will help a person in distress.
And what they found completely dismantled Abe Rosenthal's theory. The single most important factor determining whether someone would help wasn't their personality or their moral compass, or whether they lived in a big city or a small town.
It was simply how many other people were in the room.
Let me walk you through the experiments. In one setup, they had a student pretend to have a violent epileptic seizure over an intercom.
If a test subject was in the next room completely alone and heard the seizure, they rushed out to help 85% of the time.
85%.
But if that exact same test subject was told there were 4 other people listening in on the seizure with them, they only helped 31% of the time.
They ran another test that's even more visceral. Imagine you are the test subject. You're sitting in a waiting room, filling out a questionnaire. Suddenly, smoke starts seeping under the door.
If you are sitting there alone 75% of the time, you will immediately get up, walk out, and report the smoke.
But if you were sitting in that same room with a group of other people actors who are instructed to just calmly keep filling out their questionnaires, you only report the smoke 38% of the time.
You will literally sit in a room filling with smoke, coughing, and do nothing.
We have to explain the mechanism here because it's terrifying. Why do we do this?
It's the diffusion of responsibility. When you are alone, 100% of the responsibility to act falls on your shoulders. If you don't help the person having a seizure, they might die, and it's your fault.
But if you were in a group of 5 people, your brain intuitively divines that responsibility. You only feel 20% responsible. You automatically assume someone else is going to make the call.
Or worse, your brain uses the group to assess the threat level. You look around the waiting room, you see that nobody else is panicking about the smoke, and your brain concludes, well, if they aren't worried, it must not be a real fire. The screaming on the street must just be a lover's quarrel.
You let the context of the group overwrite your own senses.
Latane and Darley concluded that in the Kitty Genovese case, the lesson is not that no one called, despite the fact that 38 people heard her. The horrific, deeply tragic irony is that no one called because 38 people heard her.
If Kitty Genovese had been attacked on a dark, lonely street in the middle of nowhere with only one single witness looking out a farmhouse window, that person's sense of personal responsibility would have been at 100%.
They almost certainly would have called the cops, and she might have lived.
It forces us to realize that human beings are vastly more sensitive to their immediate environment than we want to admit. We like to think of ourselves as autonomous agents operating purely on unshakable inner moral compasses.
But we aren't. We are deeply, profoundly influenced by context.
Okay, so we've explored how the context shapes the environment, and we've explored how stickiness makes the agent permanent. Now we have to talk about the final piece of the epidemic puzzle. The engine. The people.
Let's get into the law of the few.
When we talk about the law of the few, we are talking about the structural reality that in any system, some people matter exponentially more than others.
Economists have the 80-20 principle. 20% of criminals commit 80% of crimes. 20% of drivers cause 80% of accidents.
But in social epidemics, it's vastly more extreme. It's more like the 991 principle.
Wait, I need to push back on that. I buy the 80-20 rule, but you're telling me that out of 1 million people buying Hush Puppies or a whole city catching a virus, only like 1% of the population actually caused the trend.
Yes, a microscopic percentage of people do the vast majority of the work.
Let's go back to John Potterat, the epidemiologist from Baltimore. He also studied a massive gonorrhea epidemic in Colorado Springs.
He looked at every single person who came into the public health clinics over 6 months. Colorado Springs is a city of over 100,000 people.
Potterat traced the entire epidemic and found that half the cases originated from just 4 small neighborhoods, about 6% of the city. And within that 6%, the people are all socializing in the exact same 6 bars. He interviewed 768 people in this network. He found that 600 of them were what he called non-transmitters. They got the disease, but they didn't pass it on, or maybe passed it to just one person.
The entire epidemic in a city of 100,000 was being driven by exactly 168 people.
And who are those 168 people? They are structural hubs. In the context of a sexually transmitted disease, they are individuals whose behavior is wildly, almost unbelievably outside the norm.
The source material gives us some harrowing examples of these superspreaders. In the mid-90s in East St. Louis, there was a man named Darnell Boss Man McGee.
He spent his time at roller skating rinks, targeting young girls, usually 13 or 14 years old. He'd buy them jewelry, get them high on crack, and sleep with them.
Over just 2 years before he was shot and killed, he slept with over 100 women and infected at least 30 of them with HIV.
Then you have someone like Nishawn Williams in upstate New York, working the streets of Jamestown. He maintained multiple apartments, juggled dozens of underage girls through drug-fueled parties, and infected at least 16 girls with HIV in a very short window.
And of course, the infamous patient zero of the early AIDS epidemic, Gaten Dugas, the flight attendant who claimed to have 2,500 sexual partners and was linked to at least 40 of the earliest cases in California and New York.
These individuals are human multipliers. They are the 1% driving the epidemic.
Now, obviously, social and cultural epidemics aren't driven by predatory sexual appetites, but they operate on the exact same structural principle. Cultural epidemics are driven by people with extraordinary social appetites.
People with an unnatural amount of energy, sociability, and structural influence.
Which brings us to one of my favorite historical stories of all time. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, April 18, 1775.
A stable boy overhears a British officer talking about hell to pay tomorrow. He runs to Paul Revere's house in the north end of Boston.
Revere and Joseph Warren realize the British are marching to Lexington to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and then moving to Concord to seize the colonial weapons cache.
It is the ultimate word-of-mouth emergency. The entire revolution depends on how fast this news can spread.
Revere gets rowed across Boston Harbor in the dark, jumps on a horse, and rides 13 miles in 2 hours. He hits Charlestown, Medford, North Cambridge, Menotomy, and he doesn't just yell into the void.
He knocks on specific doors, he wakes up the local militia leaders, he tells them to send out their own riders.
Church bells start ringing, drums start beating. By 9 a.m., the alarm has reached as far west as Ashby. When the British finally march, they are met with a massive, organized, fierce colonial resistance that kicks off the American Revolution.
Revere's ride is a masterpiece of social contagion. But the key to understanding why it worked isn't the urgency of the news itself.
Right, because here's the historical twist that nobody learns in school. That exact same night, a second rider named William Dawes set out from Boston carrying the exact same message.
He took a different route, traveling west through different towns, covering just as many miles as Revere. But Dawes' ride was a complete and utter failure.
The towns he rode through simply didn't mobilize. In Waltham, so few men showed up to fight the next day that historians later assumed the town must have been pro-British. It wasn't. They just didn't get the message in time.
So I have to ask, if the news is the exact same, the British are coming, why did Revere start a revolution and Dawes started absolutely nothing? Was Dawes just a slow rider?
No, it has nothing to do with horsemanship. Dawes failed because he didn't know who to wake up. When Dawes rode into a town, he likely knocked on random doors. People woke up, saw a stranger yelling about the British, and probably thought he was a drunk or a lunatic.
Revere, on the other hand, was a specific kind of person. He was a connector.
To understand what a connector is, we have to look at how human beings are networked together. We all know the trope of 6 degrees of separation, the idea that you're only 6 handshakes away from the president or a celebrity.
But where does that phrase actually come from?
It comes from a brilliant experiment designed in the late 1960s by a psychologist named Stanley Milgram. He wanted to solve the small world problem. He wanted to know if we all live in isolated, autonomous social bubbles, or if we are bound together in a giant web.
Milgram got the names of 160 random people living in Omaha, Nebraska. He mailed them each a packet. Inside the packet was the name and address of a stockbroker who lived in Sharon, Massachusetts, outside of Boston.
The instructions were simple. Get this packet to the stockbroker. But you can't just mail it directly to him. You can only mail it to a personal friend or acquaintance who you think might get it closer to him.
So if you live in Omaha and you have a cousin in Boston, you mail it to the cousin, hoping they might know someone in finance or someone who lives in Sharon.
Milgram tracked the chains of letters, and he found that on average, it took just 5 or 6 steps for the packets to reach the stockbroker in Massachusetts. Thus, 6 degrees of separation.
But the phrase 6 degrees of separation is actually deeply misleading. It implies an egalitarian network where everyone is equally linked to everyone else in 6 steps. That is not what Milgram's data actually proves.
The twist. You have to explain the twist.
When Milgram looked at the final link in the chain, the person who actually knocked on the stockbroker's door and handed him the packet, he found an incredible structural bottleneck. 24 packets reached the stockbroker at his home. 16 of those 24 packets were handed to him by the exact same guy, a clothing merchant Milgram called Mr. Jacobs.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this right. 16 separate chains originating from completely random people in Nebraska, traveling through dozens of different intermediate friends, all somehow converged on one single closing merchant.
Yes, and it gets crazier. The packets that went to the stockbroker's office mostly came through two other men, Mr. Brown and Mr. Jones. Half of all the successful packets in the entire experiment were delivered by just 3 people.
This completely blew my mind when I read it. 6 degrees of separation doesn't mean you and I are intimately connected to everyone in the world. It means that a tiny handful of people are connected to everyone in the world, and we rely on those few people to link us to the rest of humanity.
They are the Mr. Jacobses, they are the Paul Reveres, they are the connectors.
I mapped this out in my own life. I took a piece of paper and wrote down my 40 closest friends. And I worked backward. How did I meet friend A? Oh, through friend B. How did I meet B? Through C. I kept tracing the roots. And what I found was that out of my 40 closest friends, 30 of them ultimately traced back to a single guy I went to college with named Jacob. 30 out of 40.
That's incredible.
My social circle isn't a circle at all. It's an airport terminal. And Jacob is Atlanta. Every single flight, every single relationship I have has to connect through him before it goes anywhere else.
That is the defining trait of a connector. They are the Atlanta airport of human relationships. They simply know an absurd, almost pathological number of people, and we don't always appreciate how rare that is until we try to measure it.
The sources mention this amazing exercise called the Manhattan Phone Book Test. Gladwell compiled a list of about 250 random last names from the Manhattan Phone Book. Names like Alvarez, Barrows, Cohen, Gladwell, Johnson, Roos, Townsend.
The test is simple. You go down the list and give yourself a point for every name where you know someone with that surname. If you know 3 Cohens, you get 3 points.
It acts as a highly accurate proxy for the size of your social network. When Gladwell gave this test to a class of college freshmen, the average score was about 21. When he gave it to a highly educated group of academics in their 40s and 50s, the average was 39. For a random sample of professionals in their 30s, the average was 41.
That makes intuitive sense. Older people and professionals have had more time to meet people. But the average isn't what's interesting, it's the extremes. In that college class, the lowest score was 2, the highest was 95. In the professional group, the lowest was 9, and the highest was 118.
Out of 400 people tested, a handful scored way over 100. These people exist in every walk of life, in every demographic. They just have this unquenchable, instinctual drive to collect people.
Which brings us to Roger Horchow. Gladwell interviewed Horchow, a highly successful businessman from Dallas who founded the Horchow Collection mail order catalog. Horchow took the surname test and instantly scored a 98. He is a super connector.
And what's fascinating about Horchow is that he doesn't network like a sleazy corporate shark. He isn't working a room trying to extract monetary value from people. He just genuinely deeply loves people and the geometric patterns of how they connect.
So how does a guy from Dallas end up with the Broadway rights to produce the Gershwin musical Crazy for You? Because I look at this chain of connections and it is completely absurd.
It is a masterpiece of what sociologists call the weak tie. Let's break down the chain. Okay, buckle up. Horchow has a friend in New York named Mickey Shannon. Mickey introduces Horchow to Emily Paley. Emily happens to be George Gershwin's old girlfriend, and her sister Lenore was married to Ira Gershwin. Emily's husband, Lou Paley, also used to write with the Gershwins. That's link 1.
Then, Horchow happens to have lunch with Leopold Godowsky. Leopold is the son of Frances Gershwin, George's sister. Also at that lunch is Mark Gershwin, Arthur Gershwin's son. So the family looks at Horchow, this guy from Dallas, and they ask, "Why should we give you the rights? You've never worked in theater a day in your life."
And Horchow just opens his Rolodex of coincidences. He says, "I know your Aunt Emily. I've been to her house. I know the picture George painted of her in the red shawl."
He's instantly establishing credibility through social proximity. Exactly. Then he flies to Hollywood to meet Lenore, Ira's widow. And he pulls out another connection. He casually mentions a woman named Mildred Knopf. Mildred wrote a cookbook that Horchow helped introduce in Dallas. They became casual friends. It turns out Mildred's husband was Edwin Knopf, a movie producer. And Edwin Knopf was George Gershwin's closest friend. Edro was literally in the room when Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue.
When Horchow mentions to Lenore that he is close friends with Mildred Knopf, Lenore is stunned. He says, "You know her. Oh, why haven't we met before?" And she gives him the rights immediately.
We have to explain the sociological mechanism of why Horchow's networking style succeeds where others fail. It relies entirely on Mark Granovetter's theory of the strength of weak ties.
Break that down for us. Why are weak ties stronger than strong ties?
Your strong ties are your close friends, your family, your coworkers. The problem with strong ties is that they all know each other and they all occupy the same social bubble that you do. They read the same news, they go to the same places, they know the same secrets. Therefore, a strong tie rarely brings you truly new information or opportunities.
Your weak ties, however, are your casual acquaintances. The guy you met on an airplane once, the person you bought a cookbook from. Weak ties are incredibly powerful because they occupy entirely different social clusters. They are the bridges between worlds. They are the only way information from the Broadway theater world can jump to a mail-order catalog executive in Dallas.
Most of us actively avoid weak ties. We don't send birthday cards to people we met once on an airplane because we don't want the obligation of having to get dinner with them. We protect our time.
But connectors like Roger Horchow love the obligation. He has a database of 1,600 names. He tracks birthdays, anniversaries, where people went to college, who their old boyfriends were. He is perfectly happy cultivating thousands of weak, casual ties because he instinctively understands that those ties are the bridges that span across different universes.
And that is the architecture of an epidemic. If you want a $30 suede shoe to jump from the East Village to Middle America, you need a Roger Horchow. You need a Paul Revere. You need a connector to act as the bridge between the hipster kids and the mall shoppers.
We've covered a staggering amount of ground today. We've completely dismantled the myth of gradualism. We've seen that the world moves in sudden, explosive leaps.
We've seen how a tiny drop in a city's budget can turn a contained infection into a raging epidemic by altering the context. We've seen how the ungrammatical phrasing of a cigarette ad can create cognitive friction, making it permanently sticky. And we've seen how a single silversmith in Boston can out-network another writer to start a revolution, proving the law of the few.
So what does this all mean for you? If you are trying to spread an idea at work, or change a destructive habit at home, or launch a new product, the fundamental lesson is to stop trying to boil the ocean. Don't rely on massive, exhausting, gradual efforts. Look for the small, sticky change. Alter the context slightly. Change the environment of the waiting room. And above all, find the connectors. Find the people who hold the network together.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over this week. We talked about how my social circle is really just an airport terminal with my friend Jacob acting as the central hub. Take a hard look at your own life this week. Who is the Jacob or the Roger Horchow at the center of your social terminal? Who is the connector that brought you your friends, your job, maybe even your spouse?
And more importantly, if you removed that one single person from your timeline, how vastly, unimaginably different would your entire world be today? We like to think we are the sole, independent authors of our destinies, carefully charting our own linear paths. But the reality is, we might just be riding the geometric wave of an epidemic that someone else started. What epidemic are you unconsciously spreading right now?
It's a humbling thought, but also an incredibly empowering one once you understand the rules.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.